It started in the kitchen, just a casual visit, a cup of coffee. But the way she looked at me when I teased her, the way her voice caught when she whispered, "Not in here." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just my friend's mom anymore. This was the beginning of something I wasn't supposed to want and couldn't walk away from. I wasn't even supposed to be there that afternoon. My plan was simple: drop by, grab my friend, and head out. Instead, when I knocked, the door opened to someone else entirely. It was his mother. She leaned against the frame in that effortless way some people do without thinking. Her hair was pulled back loosely, like she hadn't expected company, and yet somehow that only made her seem more composed, more graceful. She blinked at me in surprise, then smiled with the kind of warmth that instantly takes the edge off your nerves. He's not home," she said, her voice low and smooth. "But you can come in, if you'd like to wait." I hesitated, but only for a second. There was something about the way her eyes lingered, welcoming, but guarded too, that made it impossible to say no. The house was quiet, still carrying that late afternoon hush, sunlight spilling across the floorboards. She guided me toward the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee lingered faintly, like it had been brewed not long ago. "Would you like a cup?" she asked, already reaching for a mug before I could answer. I sat at the table, suddenly hyper-aware of every little detail. The way her bracelets slid down her wrist as she moved. The sound of the cupboard door closing softly. The steam curling up from the kettle as she poured. When she set the mug in front of me, our fingers brushed, barely. Just enough for me to feel the warmth of her skin, for the moment to hang in the air a little too long before she drew her hand back. We talked. Small things at first. How school had been for me. How work was keeping her busy. How quickly time seemed to pass. But there was something different in the way she listened. She didn't just wait for her turn to speak. She leaned in, her eyes steady, her expression soft, like what I said actually mattered. I couldn't help noticing the little things. How her laughter was quieter than her son's, but deeper, steadier. How the light caught the lines at the corner of her eyes, not in a way that made her seem older, but wiser, like each one carried a memory. And all the while, there was this undercurrent, a closeness I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the silence between words, how it stretched just long enough to make me aware of it. Maybe it was the way her arm brushed mine when she reached for the sugar, the way her sleeve grazed my skin like an afterthought. The kitchen was suddenly too small, too filled with the sound of her voice, the warmth of her presence. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just sitting across from my friend's mom. I was sitting across from a woman who, without even trying, had me completely caught up in her orbit. And I wasn't sure I wanted to leave. The kitchen felt warmer than it should have been. Maybe it was the steam still curling up from our coffee, or maybe it was just her presence, filling the space in a way that made the walls seem closer than before. I tried to act natural, leaning back in the chair, sipping from the mug she'd given me. But every little movement she made tugged at my attention. The way her hand lingered on the counter, the faint sound of her bracelets shifting as she adjusted her sleeve, the soft rhythm of her breathing in the quiet room. At one point, she stood close to me, reaching up for something on the top shelf. I rose half out of my chair, automatically offering, "Here, let me help." Our arms brushed as I stretched up beside her. Just that, the lightest touch of skin, but it jolted through me like a current. I handed her the jar she wanted, but for a moment neither of us moved. Her fingers hovered near mine, not taking it right away, her eyes flicking toward me before darting away again. I finally let go, the glass clicking softly against her palm. She smiled, but it wasn't careless. It was the kind of smile people use when they're covering something they don't want to admit. I went to sit back down, but as I passed her in the narrow kitchen, my shoulder brushed hers again. This time, the air felt charged, heavy with something unsaid. She laughed softly, almost under her breath, shaking her head. Then she spoke the words that would replay in my mind long after that moment. "Not in the kitchen." The tone caught me off guard. It wasn't scolding. It wasn't casual either. It was something in between, playful, but edged with a seriousness she couldn't quite hide. I froze, standing just a step away from her. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Her eyes lingered on mine for the briefest second before she looked down, fussing with the jar in her hands as if it suddenly needed all her attention. She started, then stopped. A small, almost embarrassed smile crossed her face. Some things don't belong here. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. She wasn't talking about sugar or coffee or cupboards. She was talking about us, about this strange pull that neither of us had put into words, but both of us felt. The silence stretched between us, and in that pause I caught the tiniest shift in her breathing, the faintest tremble in her fingers as she set the jar down. She wasn't unaffected. Not at all. I wanted to say something, to tease, to reassure, to push just a little further, but instead I just sat back down at the table, watching her move around the kitchen like nothing had happened. Only now, every glance, every step, every small gesture carried a weight it hadn't before. And the words, "not in the kitchen," echoed in my mind, not as a warning, but as an invitation to wonder where else this quiet current between us might lead. Her words still echoed in the quiet. Not in the kitchen. I tried to laugh it off, but the truth was I couldn't stop turning it over in my head. She'd said it with that mix of teasing and warning, like she knew exactly what I was feeling but wasn't ready to admit it out loud. I sat there, fingers tapping lightly against the mug, watching her move around the kitchen with this grace that made even simple things, opening a cupboard, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, seemed deliberate. Something in me stirred, a kind of courage I didn't usually have. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at me just before glancing away. Maybe it was the fact that the silence between us had grown heavy enough to press against my chest. I spoke before I had the chance to second-guess myself. "Then show me your bedroom." The words slipped out half playful, half serious, my voice lower than I expected. She froze. Not dramatically, not in some obvious way, but just enough that I noticed. Her hand paused on the counter, her back still turned to me. The air seemed to thicken around us. When she finally turned, her eyes found mine. There wasn't anger in them. No shock either. Just a kind of stillness, a sharp awareness that made my heart beat faster. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it like a joke. Instead, she let a few seconds stretch out between us, her expression unreadable. And in those seconds, I felt every possibility rush through me. That I'd crossed a line, that I'd ruined something, that maybe, just maybe, she'd been waiting for me to be bold enough to say it. But she didn't answer. Instead, she smoothed the fabric of her sleeve, like her hands suddenly needed something to do. She reached for her coffee cup, though it was already empty, lifting it and setting it back down as if that small movement could break the tension. Finally, she cleared her throat softly. "You shouldn't say things like that," she murmured, but her voice wasn't firm. It was quiet, uncertain, almost trembling. I leaned forward slightly, searching her face. "Why not?" I asked gently. Her eyes flickered toward me, then away, settling on the table instead. She pressed her lips together, like she had a dozen answers, but none she was willing to let out. And then, with a faint, evasive smile, she changed the subject. She asked if I wanted another coffee, her tone light, too light, like nothing had happened. But her hands gave her away. The slight shake as she reached for the kettle. The way her fingers lingered on the handle a second too long. I sat back, pulse racing, realizing I'd touched something she couldn't ignore, no matter how quickly she tried to bury it beneath casual words. She hadn't rejected me. She hadn't laughed it off. She'd hesitated. And in that hesitation, I heard the truth she wasn't ready to say. Time seemed to stretch after my words, and her careful deflection. The kettle hummed quietly, the only sound in the room, until even that fell away into silence. We sat there longer than expected, sipping what little remained of our coffee, talking about small things that barely touched the surface. The conversation was there, but the weight beneath it was impossible to ignore. When she rose to clear the cups, I followed instinctively, gathering mine and setting it beside hers at the sink. She gave me a small look, not quite a smile, not quite a warning, and passed me a dish towel as if to distract me with something practical. So we cleaned together. It was simple, ordinary, but in that quiet kitchen, even ordinary things felt charged. My arm brushed hers when I reached for a plate. Her fingers grazed mine when she handed me a glass. Every tiny touch was magnified, echoing louder than it should have. At one point, I noticed her pause, her hand resting on the edge of the counter as if steadying herself. She caught me watching and looked away quickly, focusing instead on the task at hand. When the last dish was set aside, she leaned back against the counter, exhaling softly. I wiped my hands, then asked the question that had been pressing at me ever since she'd fallen silent. "Are you angry with me?" Her head turned sharply, eyes widening just slightly. "Angry," she repeated, as if the thought had never crossed her mind. "For what I said earlier," I explained. "I didn't mean to cross a line." For a moment, she didn't answer. She just looked at me, searching my face like she was weighing what kind of man I was, and whether I'd meant those words as a careless joke or as something more. Finally, she shook her head gently. "No," she whispered. "I'm not angry, just surprised." Her voice softened on that last word, and with it came something else, a flicker of vulnerability, quickly hidden behind a composed expression. I stepped a little closer, not enough to intrude, but enough that the space between us felt smaller. "Surprised in a bad way?" I asked quietly. She let out a faint, nervous laugh, glancing down at the floor. "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't expect that." Her honesty caught me off guard. She wasn't scolding, wasn't shutting me out. She was letting me see the crack in her composure, the uncertainty that mirrored my own. When she finally looked back at me, her eyes lingered longer than before. And in that look, the age difference between us was undeniable. Her gaze was steady, guarded, cautious, while mine was open, hungry, filled with the kind of reckless hope only someone younger might allow themselves. But still, she didn't step away. The house felt different then. Not just quiet, but heavy with something fragile, something neither of us dared to name. Every creak of the floor, every shift of light through the window, seemed amplified. And standing there, so close I could almost feel the warmth radiating from her, I realized this wasn't just a fleeting attraction. This was a turning point. The moment we both knew we were standing on a line, and neither of us was ready to move back. When she finally set the towel aside, the kitchen felt too close, too exposed. She stood for a long moment as if weighing something in her mind, then quietly gestured toward the living room. "Come on," she said softly. I followed her down the short hallway, the shift in space immediate. The living room was dimmer, the afternoon light filtered through sheer curtains, the furniture arranged in a way that made the air feel softer, more private. Here, the silence wasn't awkward, it was deliberate. She sat first, choosing the edge of the couch, her posture upright, careful. I hesitated before sitting beside her, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The cushions sank beneath our weight, bringing us just a little nearer. At first, we talked about safe things again. Music, old family photos on the wall, the books stacked on the coffee table. But the words felt like placeholders, as if both of us were searching for anything to distract from what hung unspoken between us. Every so often, her knee brushed mine. Sometimes she pulled back quickly, as though remembering herself. Other times she didn't, letting the contact linger for a heartbeat longer than necessary. And all the while, I found myself studying the details I'd never noticed before. The way her hair slipped loose from the clip at the back of her head. The faint scent of her perfume, warm and steady, like something familiar and comforting but laced with danger now. The delicate way she held her coffee cup earlier, like everything she touched mattered. The conversation shifted slowly, almost without realizing it, into something deeper. She spoke about the past, the things she wished she'd done differently, the opportunities she'd let slip away. Her voice softened when she mentioned regrets, a rare crack in the confident image she usually carried. I listened, not just with my ears, but with my whole attention. Every word felt like she was letting me into a part of her world she rarely shared. And when she paused, I admitted some of my own uncertainties, the way I wasn't sure about my future, the fear of making the wrong choices before my life had even really begun. Her eyes lingered on me then, thoughtful, steady, as if she saw more in me than I'd ever dared to hope anyone might. The closeness grew from that, not physical at first, but emotional. The kind of intimacy where you realize you're sitting inches apart and don't even remember moving closer. There was a pause after one of my sentences, the kind of pause that stretched and thickened, pulling us toward it. Her gaze met mine. Neither of us looked away. I felt the air shift, heavy with the possibility of what might come next. My hand twitched slightly, wanting to reach for hers. She noticed. I could see it in the way her breath caught, in the faint parting of her lips as though she might speak, but thought better of it. We didn't kiss. Not yet. But sitting there, shoulders brushing, eyes locked in silence, it felt like we had already crossed the invisible line that divided friendship from something more. The living room had become our confession, without a single word spoken. The living room had gone quiet again, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. We sat close, shoulders brushing lightly, the air between us heavier with every passing second. I could feel her hesitancy. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, but her posture was tight, as if she were holding herself back. Her eyes flickered toward me now and then, only to retreat to the coffee table or the faint glow of the window. And then, in a moment so small I almost missed it, her hand shifted. Just an inch at first, then another, until finally, her fingers brushed against mine where they rested on the cushion. It wasn't bold, not deliberate. It was tentative, a test, a question. I turned my hand slowly, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, her fingers settled gently over mine, warm and steady, though I felt the slightest tremor in her touch. The world outside seemed to fade. All I could feel was the weight of her hand, the softness of her skin, the unspoken courage it must have taken for her to bridge that space between us. She drew in a quiet breath, and I heard the faintest break in her voice when she whispered, "This is dangerous." Her words should have made me retreat. Instead, they pulled me closer, not in movement, but in the way I leaned into her presence, the way my thumb brushed across the back of her hand, slow and deliberate, reassuring her without saying anything at all. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She held my gaze, her expression caught between conflict and longing. I could see it there, the careful woman who had built her life around rules and order, and the part of her aching to let go, if only for a moment. She leaned closer, not enough to close the distance for a kiss, but enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath against my cheek. Her hair slipped loose, brushing softly across my jaw. My heart thudded so hard I thought she might hear it. And then, instead of kissing me, she let her forehead rest against my shoulder. Gently, like she was surrendering, but only in the safest way she could manage. Her arms stayed at her sides, her hands still clasped in mine, but the weight of her leaning against me was enough to make the world tilt. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head just enough that my cheek brushed the crown of her hair. She smelled faintly of jasmine and coffee, a mix so tender it made my chest ache. We sat like that for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just existing in the closeness, the quiet rhythm of her breathing syncing with mine. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a confession. But it was the first time she let herself rest against me. The first time she allowed the connection between us to become something real, something tangible. And in that stillness, I knew this was only the beginning. Her forehead rested against my shoulder, her hand still clasped in mine, and for a moment I wished time would stop right there. The quiet was so complete I could hear the faint tick of a clock down the hall, the soft creak of the house as it settled in the fading afternoon light. She drew in a long breath, her chest rising gently against my arm, then let it out with a trembling sigh. Slowly, she leaned back, her hand slipping free though her touch lingered as if reluctant to let go. When her eyes met mine, there was a small, wavering smile. Half of it was relief, half of it was something harder to name. Longing, maybe. Fear, too. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet it felt as if the words carried straight through me. "I haven't let myself feel like this in a very long time." I nodded, my throat tight, unsure what to say. The truth was, I didn't know what I was doing either. I only knew that sitting next to her, holding her hand, felt more right than anything else had in a long time. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, I said gently. I just don't want you to think I don't respect you. Because I do. More than you know. Her eyes softened then, and she looked away as if the weight of my words was almost too much to hold. She reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, then laughed faintly, a nervous, self-conscious sound. You're too young to talk like that, she teased, though her tone was more tender than playful. Maybe, I said, but I mean it. That silence returned, only now it didn't feel heavy. It felt warm, safe. She shifted closer, hesitating only a moment before slipping her arms around my waist. I felt her head settle lightly against my chest, and without thinking, I wrapped my arms around her. Her embrace wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was careful, steady, as though she was letting herself believe in the safety of it, inch by inch. I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, the gentle weight of her against me, and I held her tighter, memorizing the moment. Eventually, she pulled back, though her hands lingered at my sides. She looked at me with that same half-smile, eyes shining in the dim light. I don't know where this could go, she whispered. But I don't want to pretend it isn't there anymore. I didn't answer with words. I just brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face, my fingers grazing her cheek for a fleeting second. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, before pulling away with a soft sigh. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Our goodbye wasn't rushed. She leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek, her hand resting briefly on my arm. And as I stepped out into the cooling evening air, I could still feel her warmth against my skin. I walked away knowing nothing had been promised, no future drawn out. But something real had begun in that quiet living room. Something fragile, something dangerous, something I would never forget.